When I stepped onto the porch of my home in Denver after a trip where I was supposed to meet my first grandchild, I found an envelope resting against the doorframe. The red stamp on the front read, "Urgent Review, Guardianship Draft, January 14th, 9:22 a.m., signed by M. Raines." My son's name. His signature. On a guardianship document over me. I felt the familiar weight of my wool scarf slipping down my shoulder as I opened the door. Before I could take a full breath, I heard voices drifting from my study, my private space, the room where I kept Harold's letters and my museum notes. Michael was speaking to someone in a low, practiced tone. "She's mixing up dates again. The court will accept that. We'll file by the end of the week." The hallway seemed to narrow around me. A cold wave moved from my fingertips to my spine. How could they do this to me? If this moment stirs something familiar in you, stay with me. What comes next is the truth I carried in silence for far too long. I stood in the open doorway for a long moment, feeling the dry Denver air settle around me, carrying the faint smell of snow even though the sky was clear. My suitcase, still stiff from the airport carousel, leaned against my leg. I remember noticing the small scrape on its corner, a scrape that hadn't been there before. A detail so trivial, and yet it fixed itself in my mind. Maybe because everything else, everything that mattered, felt suddenly unsteady. My name is Margaret Raines. 73 years old. A former curator at the Colorado History Museum. I spent my life handling fragile things, beaded buckskin dresses, century-old letters, clay vessels that had survived fires and floods and impossible luck. I preserved what time tried to erase. That had been my craft, my devotion. And I had believed, perhaps too simply, that the same care I gave to the past would return to me through those I raised. Michael was my only child. I worked double shifts after Harold died so I could keep our home and still pay for his education at the University of Oregon. I never complained. I never asked him to repay the money from his student loans that I quietly covered when he fell behind. I told myself that generosity was a form of love, and love, once given, always found its way back. But standing in that doorway, listening to his voice inside my study, I realized how naive that belief had been. Michael wasn't alone that morning. The other voice, lower, clipped, belonged to Ms. Marlene Belmont, his lawyer. She was the kind of woman who wore her certainty like a pressed suit. She had visited my house twice before, both times under the guise of helping Michael with paperwork. Each visit had left me with an odd sensation, as if some tiny thread in the fabric of my life had been quietly snipped. They depended on me in ways they never acknowledged. Money, yes. Advice. A place to land when Michael's startups collapsed, and they always did, one after another. Emotional support when his relationships failed. They arrived at my door with tired eyes and empty hands, and I always welcomed them with tea and whatever soup I had simmering on the stove. I never kept score. My heart wasn't built that way. Yet here they were, in my house, discussing me as though I were an object to be handled. A problem to be solved. A file to be moved across a desk. I stepped out of my shoes by the door the way I always did, out of habit, even in that moment of betrayal. The hardwood floor felt cool beneath my stockings. The envelope trembled slightly in my hand as I held it up to the light. Guardianship. My own son preparing a legal mechanism to take control of my life. It was a peculiar kind of pain, quiet, internal, almost polite. Not the sharp grief of losing Harold. Not the shock of the late-night call years ago when Michael crashed my old Subaru and walked away without telling me for 2 days. This pain was slow-moving, like frost creeping across a windowpane. And beneath it, something else began to stir. Something older and steadier. A dignity I had never learned to wield, because I had never needed to. I took a breath and let my eyes wander across the hallway. There was the photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The framed map of Colorado's mining towns I rescued from an estate sale in 1989. The polished wooden coat rack Michael built in the 7th grade, tilted, imperfect, still precious. These small pieces of my life had survived so much. They had endured the indifference of time better than the people I trusted. Pride rose in me, but not the kind that shouts. It was quieter, heavier. A pride that came from knowing the truth of who I was, a woman who had carried her family, who had rebuilt her life twice, who had stood in museum basements under flickering lights cataloging histories no one else remembered. I knew the strength in my own hands, the steadiness in my mind. No draft document with my name stamped on it could erase that. But bitterness began to surface too, thin at first, then sharper. It wasn't the bitterness of anger. It was the bitterness of recognition. The bitterness of finally seeing the true shape of something that had been hidden in shadows. Michael and Ms. Belmont weren't simply taking advantage of me. They were trying to redefine me. To recast me as frail, confused, incapable. They wanted the world to believe a version of me that had never existed. And they were willing to twist my life into evidence to make it so. I had preserved so many artifacts over the years. I knew when something genuine was being replaced with a forgery. Standing there, the envelope pressed against my palm, I felt the first solid edge of resolve. If they wanted a story about me, then I would write the truth myself. I remembered the first small shift, so slight at the time I almost dismissed it. It was early December, a cold morning when the kitchen windows carried thin halos of frost. Michael had stopped by unannounced, the way he sometimes did when he needed something. I was sorting through winter tax documents, my reading glasses perched on the edge of my nose, and he watched me for a moment with a look I didn't yet understand. "Mom, you forgot your password again? Let me merge everything into one system so it's easier for you." I hesitated. Not because I was confused, but because I knew exactly what I was doing. My handwriting was clear, my notes organized, my accounts balanced to the cent. But he said it so gently, as if he were offering a kindness. I smiled back then, thinking it was simply a son trying to help his aging mother. I handed him the small notepad where I kept temporary codes, trusting him the way I always had. Now, standing in the hallway of my home, that moment returned to me like a stone dropping into water, ripples spreading outward, connecting to things I hadn't pieced together before. It wasn't about passwords. It was about access. And then came the second moment. A week later, a message appeared in my inbox from a health monitoring service I had never subscribed to, an application submitted in my name. When I asked Michael about it, he brushed it off. "It's standard, Mom. Just keeping track of things. You don't need to worry." His tone was practiced, reassuring, but his eyes flickered away from mine. I remember the exact sound in the room that day, the steady hum of the fridge, the click of the heater as it switched off, the faint rattle of wind against the back door. The world seemed to hold its breath while I waited for an explanation he didn't offer. The third moment arrived quietly but cut deeper. Michael informed me that he had replaced our long-trusted accountant, Mr. Hanley, with a large financial firm I had never heard of. He said the words lightly, almost offhand. "Mom, you don't need to deal with numbers anymore." I remember the sting. Not anger, something softer, sadder. As if a part of my competence, my independence, was being packed into a box and carried out the door. Mr. Hanley had handled Harold's estate, our mortgage, my museum pension. He knew our family's history better than most of our relatives. And just like that, he was dismissed. The fourth moment came only days before my trip to see my granddaughter. Michael reached for my car keys as I prepared to drive to the doctor. "Let me take these in for inspection," he said. "It's overdue." He slipped them into his jacket pocket with a reassuring pat. They never found their way back into my hands. At the time, each incident seemed isolated, a pebble rolling down a slope. But now, with the guardianship envelope still warm from my grip, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Small humiliations, subtle erasures. The kind of shifts that make a person question themselves before they question anyone else. Sadness rose first, a quiet, familiar ache. But beneath it, something steadier formed. A recognition. A boundary taking shape. Those pebbles had never been random. They were the early tremors of a mountain beginning to break. I stood there remembering each incident with the clarity that only hindsight offers. Little things I had brushed aside began to assemble themselves into a structure I could no longer ignore. I recalled the afternoon when Michael insisted on organizing my filing cabinet. He had opened drawers that hadn't been touched in years, drawers where Harold's old insurance letters and travel receipts lived. He held the papers delicately, but his eyes moved with a kind of calculation, as though searching for something specific. At the time I assumed he was trying to help me declutter. Now, I wondered what he had really been looking for. There was also the morning he arrived with a new smartphone, already purchased, already set up. He placed it on my kitchen table with a gentle firmness. "Your old one isn't secure," he said. "This will back up everything automatically." I thanked him, though the gesture puzzled me. I hadn't asked for a new phone. And the old one worked perfectly well. But he insisted, and I let the matter rest. Later, I noticed certain apps were pre-installed: financial tracking, location sharing, cloud syncing. Features I never turned on, but which quietly gathered information I didn't know was being stored. Even the tone of his visits had shifted. Michael used to bring small things when he came by, fresh bread from the market, or a new pen he thought I'd enjoy for my cataloging notes. But over the past months, he arrived empty-handed, moving through the house with a restless energy. He lingered near my desk. He opened drawers without asking. Once, I walked into the room to find him holding my checkbook, flipping through the pages as though searching for a discrepancy. He looked up quickly, offering a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said. I told myself it was concern, though something inside me unsettled. A quiet instinct, one I had ignored for far too long. There was also a moment, small, almost forgettable, when he commented on my handwriting. I had been writing a letter to an old colleague, and he leaned over my shoulder, squinting. "Your script looks different these days," he murmured. A little shaky. I looked at the page afterward. The letters were the same as they'd always been, steady, neat, measured. I had written thousands of labels and catalog cards in my career. My hands knew the rhythm. But he planted a seed of doubt, and for several days I caught myself studying my penmanship, wondering if age had begun tracing itself into the ink. These moments, each so slight and ordinary, had formed the undercurrent that pulled me toward this point. All the while, I kept telling myself I was imagining things. That Michael was simply stressed, overworked, trying in clumsy ways to prepare for adulthood's uncertainties. Yet the truth had been gathering quietly, like dust on a forgotten shelf. Now I saw it, none of these were accidents. They were steps, precise, incremental, intentional. And they led directly to the guardianship envelope waiting on my porch. A tremor moved through me, not fear, but recognition. Something inside me stirred with the weight of my own history. I had survived far more than subtle manipulations. I had rebuilt a life from widowhood, from long nights alone, from responsibilities that felt too heavy for one pair of hands. I knew endurance. I knew truth. And now, for the first time in months, I felt the shape of my own strength returning, quiet but undeniable. The mountain had started to break, but so had the silence inside me. I didn't enter the study that day. Instead, I stepped quietly back into the hallway and let the door fall shut, not fully but just enough that their voices softened into a muffled blur. I felt the weight of my own breath in my chest, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The house I had tended for decades, the walls I had painted after Harold passed, the floorboards I polished each spring, now held a conversation about dismantling my life as if I were not standing only steps away. I placed my suitcase by the coat rack and brushed a bit of lint from its handle. Such an ordinary gesture, and yet it felt like I was anchoring myself to something solid. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed small differences I hadn't seen before. My spice drawer was rearranged. The calendar on the fridge had been replaced with a digital printout I didn't make. A small device blinked beneath the cabinet, a health monitor, the kind that syncs with an online account. I hadn't bought it. I hadn't approved it. But someone had plugged it in. I reached for the kettle, ran my fingers over the familiar dent near the handle, and filled it with water. While it heated, I opened the drawer where I kept receipts, warranties, and small household papers. That drawer had always been my domain, organized with a quiet order that made sense only to me. But now, folders had been shifted, clipped together in ways I never used. Someone had been searching. A faint realization settled in, a pattern forming in the periphery of memory. The uninvited software on my computer that Michael said was for security. The new router he installed without asking, claiming the internet was slow. The envelopes he collected from the mailbox before I had a chance to reach them. At the time, I believed he was helping. Yet now, with the guardianship envelope on my porch, the truth glimmered through each act like a thread of silver in dark cloth. 2 days before my trip, I recalled waking to find Michael in the garage. He said he was checking the fuse box. But my car, my old, steady Volvo, was parked slightly differently when I came down. The seat was moved forward, the mirrors tilted. I sat inside that morning noticing the smell of a cologne he never wore, and brushed it away as imagination. Now I saw it clearly, he wasn't inspecting fuses. He was inspecting me. The kettle clicked off. I poured the water into my chipped blue mug, the one Harold bought at a street fair in Santa Fe. Its warmth grounded me. I stood at the counter, watching steam curl upward, and listened as Michael's voice rose slightly in the study. A firmness. A certainty. As though I were already incapable. As though my history, my years of work, my steady mind counted for nothing. She'll resist at first, he said. But once the paperwork goes through, she won't have a choice. The words carried through the corridor like a draft under a locked door. I set the mug down, steadier than I felt. There was no misunderstanding left to cling to. His intentions were no longer scattered hints, they were a plan, intact and advancing. I walked toward the dining room, letting my fingers graze the edge of the table Harold built. The wood felt cool, solid. The sunlight landed across its surface in a pale ribbon, illuminating a stack of mail I didn't recognize. The top envelope bore my name in a printed label, but the return address was to a firm in Chicago. A firm handling asset review. I opened it carefully. Inside were forms, half filled, half signed, and a note, awaiting final authorization from M. Rains. My heart tightened, not with panic but with an almost clinical understanding. He had been preparing this for months. I slipped the papers back into the envelope and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was still, the morning light touching the roofs, the faint smell of pine drifting in. It struck me how unchanged everything looked, how ordinary. Yet within these walls, a quiet siege had taken place. I thought of the Sunday dinners Michael missed, the excuses about deadlines, the abrupt departures. He hadn't been pulling away from me emotionally, as I feared. He had been pulling documents, permissions, and pieces of authority from the life I had built. Each absence was not a drifting, it was preparation. I opened the drawer of the sideboard and pulled out the leather-bound planner Harold gave me in our last Christmas together. I ran my thumb along its spine and opened to the week before my trip. Appointments, notes, reminders, all written in the same sturdy script I had used for decades. Nothing misplaced, nothing confused. Proof of my mind's own clarity. And yet, Michael was telling someone I was mixing up dates. I closed the planner gently, as though preserving an artifact. My gaze drifted toward the study door where he still spoke in lowered tones. I realized then that this was not a moment to crumble. This was a moment to observe, to record, as I had done with every fragile piece of history entrusted to my care. The rising tension inside the house was not chaos, it was revelation. Each detail, each small shift, was a line of evidence. And I understood, with a curator's calm, that I would need every one of them. I straightened the corner of the envelope, breathed in the faint scent of lavender from the candle I always kept on the console table, and let the truth settle fully into place. They believed they were closing in. But they were only revealing themselves. I stood there, steady, letting each realization settle like dust in a sunbeam. I had spent my life examining remnants of other people's choices, tracing patterns long buried. Now I was tracing my own. The house felt different, still mine, yet marked by intentions not my own. But beneath the tension, something else rose, a calm certainty that I was not drifting into confusion, but waking into clarity. And clarity, once found, does not return to silence. I knew then that this awakening would be calm. I heard Michael's voice shift, an edge of impatience seeping into each syllable. I moved closer, just until the grain of the door pressed lightly against my cheek. The air felt still, thick, as if the house itself sensed what was coming. "We'll say she forgot the utility payments," he said. "I already took photos. And this document," I could hear the faint rustle of paper, "proves she doesn't understand what she signs." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My own son, in my own study, preparing the final piece of a story he had been crafting behind my back. A story where I was diminished, confused, unfit. I stepped back and steadied myself against the wall. The wood felt cool beneath my palm. Then I saw it, his phone lying on the corner of the entry table, its screen glowing softly. I lifted it with careful fingers. A photograph filled the display, me, in my kitchen, hunched slightly as I reached for a jar on the top shelf. The lighting was poor, my expression tired. The file name struck like a blow, Evidence A. My chest tightened. I remembered that day. I had just returned from sorting old museum archives, dusty and exhausted. He had insisted on stopping by, just to check in. While I warmed leftovers in the microwave, he had quietly lifted his phone and captured that image. Now I understood why. I scrolled further, another photo, this time of my desk with scattered envelopes. They weren't scattered when I left them. A short video clip followed, Michael filming the thermostat blinking after a power outage, narrating softly, "She keeps forgetting to reset it." His voice carried the tone of someone documenting fragile behavior, something pitiable. A hollowness opened in my chest, a clean, slicing ache, not panic. This was recognition. I set the phone back exactly where it had been. I straightened my posture, felt the solidness of my feet on the hardwood, and let the truth settle. Michael wasn't acting out of fear or concern. He was constructing a case. And he was nearly done. Inside the study, I heard him again. "The court date can be pushed if needed," he said. "But the sooner she's declared incapable, the sooner we can manage everything." We. Not he. We. Ms. Belmont murmured something I couldn't make out. Michael replied, "She won't fight. She doesn't even realize how far things have slipped." I closed my eyes, not in defeat, but in recollection. Harold's laughter in this hallway. The smell of cinnamon rolls cooling on Sundays. The years I spent cataloging artifacts in basement archives, identifying authenticity by a single fracture line. The knitted hat I had bought for my newborn granddaughter still tucked in my suitcase. I opened my eyes. The world sharpened. They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought I couldn't. I walked toward the living room window. The winter light stretched across the hardwood, pale and steady. Outside, the mountains stood patient, unmoved by human schemes. I placed my palm on the cold glass, watched my breath cloud the surface, and felt something settle inside me, clarity, not fear. A memory surfaced, restoring an old map with Harold. Beneath the worn ink, we found a crease invisible to most. The entire restoration depended on understanding it. Without recognizing that weakness, the parchment would tear under the slightest pressure. Michael's actions were that crease, subtle, then unmistakable once seen. A fault line disguised as care. I walked back toward the study door. Their voices softened, papers shuffled. I imagined Michael leaning forward, rehearsing his narrative, believing it airtight. Believing I was already diminished. But he had forgotten something essential. I was still here. Still capable. Still myself. I turned into the hallway where the familiar hum of the heater filled the air. The lavender candle flickered, casting a thin line of light across the guardianship envelope. I picked it up again, studying the printed date, the signature, his signature, and felt resolve harden like cooling glass. If he wanted to turn my life into evidence, he had underestimated the woman who preserved centuries-old histories with patience and precision. I opened my planner, tracing each neat line of ink. Not a single date out of order. Not a single note misplaced. Proof of my mind's steadiness. Then, in a whisper meant only for myself, I said, "Not anymore." The words didn't need echo. They existed like a stamp pressed into wax, quiet, final, irrevocable. I slid the planner back onto the table and felt calmness settle into my bones. This was the moment. The line. The fracture becoming visible. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that everything Michael had built, the photos, the stage desks, the recorded thermostat, would soon collapse beneath the weight of my clarity. He believed he held all the power. But he had forgotten who taught him how to stand. I stood in the quiet of my hallway, the guardianship envelope still resting in my hand, its paper warm from my touch. Yet something inside me had cooled, become sharp and steady, as if all the drifting uncertainty of the past months had crystallized into one simple truth: I was not the confused woman they believed me to be. I was not weak. I was not slipping. I was awake. I walked into the living room and set the envelope on the coffee table, noticing the sunlight pooling gently across the wood grain. The house felt strangely still, no longer a battleground, but a place where clarity had finally taken root. I picked up my suitcase, placed it upright by the window, and realized the gesture meant something I hadn't understood earlier. I wasn't running. I wasn't preparing to escape. I was bracing myself to remain, to confront, to reclaim the ground beneath my feet. I moved through each room slowly, seeing the small signs of intrusion I had overlooked. The rearranged drawers. The new router. The health monitor blinking under the cabinet. The photos on the wall, slightly crooked, as if someone had brushed past them without care. These details formed a map, and for the first time, I could read it fully. And as I walked, memories rose, not dramatic ones, but quiet moments where Michael had redirected conversations, spoken for me, softened truths on my behalf. Each one had once looked like kindness. Now I saw the scaffolding beneath them. I paused by the bookshelf, resting my fingertips on the spine of an Atlas Herald and I used to plan road trips. I opened it to a familiar fold, seeing our penciled notes around towns we'd never had the chance to visit. A calm steadiness settled into my chest. I had traveled farther, endured more, than Michael ever understood. The realization didn't strike like lightning. It arrived like breath returning after years of holding too tightly. My strength didn't need to roar. It only needed to exist. I sat in Harold's armchair, the fabric worn soft from the shape of his shoulders. I folded my hands and let my thoughts arrange themselves with the same care I once used to arrange artifacts. Michael's case against me depended on silence, on my reluctance to contradict him, my instinct to protect him from consequence. I had allowed that pattern for years. But now the balance had shifted. I reached for my phone, opened the recorder, and spoke clearly, methodically, about what I had heard. My voice sounded steady, almost archival. When I saved the file, I named it simply, Statement. The house hummed softly around me. A car passed down the street. Ordinary sounds. But everything had changed. I lit the lavender candle in the kitchen and watched the flame climb the wick. Its scent filled the air, warm, familiar. Harold used to say that preservation wasn't only about objects but about honoring the truth they carried. I understood him more fully now. Because this wasn't just about defending myself. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own life, the life Michael hoped to revise without my permission. I stood straighter. The years of careful work and quiet survival settled around me like armor. I walked back to the window, letting my gaze fall across the yard. A neighbor passed with her dog. Life went on, unaware of the shift unfolding behind my walls. That was how betrayal hid, inside routine, inside assumptions that nothing had changed. My garden lay dormant under winter light. I thought of the roses Harold planted for our 10th anniversary, how they returned each spring, stubborn and bright. How many times had I trimmed them to keep them healthy? The metaphor was impossible to ignore. For the first time, I saw Michael clearly, not as my child, but as a man who had chosen convenience over truth, control over relationship. It hurt. But clarity often does. I walked to the hallway mirror. My hair, silvering gently. The lines near my eyes. But my gaze, clear. Focused. Undiminished. The silence in the house felt different now, not heavy but spacious, like a room newly opened. I crossed my arms gently, not out of defense, but out of certainty. The truth stood beside me. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the folder of important documents, birth certificates, Harold's letters, the deed to the house. I laid them in careful rows. Each page a testament to the life I had built piece by piece. A life no one would take from me. I closed my eyes and let the final understanding settle. The fear was never about losing control. It was about losing trust. And now, stripped of illusion, I stood on steady ground. When I opened my eyes, the path forward was clear. I was ready to act with purpose. I sat in the quiet after the realization settled, feeling the truth move through me with a slow, steady certainty. I had spent years avoiding conflict, believing that patience was a form of love. But now I understood that silence could be mistaken for weakness, and compliance could be rewritten as incapacity. I rose from Harold's armchair with a clarity that felt almost ceremonial. The house, still holding the warmth of morning light, felt like a witness rather than a battleground. The first step was simple, procedural, documentation. I walked to my desk, opened the top drawer, and removed the small external drive where I kept personal files. It clicked softly as it connected to my laptop. I transferred the audio recording I had made earlier, the one titled Statement, and created a folder labeled Protection. I copied every relevant email, every suspicious subscription notice, every alert from the financial firm I never authorized. Each file slid into place like a tile in a mosaic I had been assembling without knowing it. Next, I retrieved my phone and scrolled to Jenna Carson's name, the woman who had stood by my sister during her legal nightmare years ago. Jenna once saved an entire family from losing their home to a predatory contract. I knew she would know what to do. My thumb hovered only a moment before I pressed call. Margaret? Her voice was warm, steady. I need your help, I said. It's serious. And I have evidence. She didn't hesitate. Tell me everything. I spoke calmly, recounting each detail, the documents, the staged photos, the unauthorized applications, the conversation in my study. Jenna listened without interruption, the way she always had when truth mattered. When I finished, there was a long exhale on the other end. I'll be on the first flight, she said. Do not confront him today. Just secure everything. I ended the call and felt a steadiness settle inside me. Help was coming, but my own actions had already begun shaping the boundary I needed. I walked to the safe in my bedroom closet, a quiet metal box that had held our passports, Harold's watch, and the small inheritance documents from my parents. I placed inside it the external drive, the planner with my notes, and the guardianship envelope. I locked the safe and tested the handle twice, listening for the solid click. Then I opened my banking app, entered my credentials, and initiated a freeze on all external access. The screen blinked as the confirmation appeared. Michael's linked devices were removed one by one, each disappearing like a tether snapping silently in the dark. I continued through each account: utilities, mortgage, insurance, resetting passwords, removing permissions, securing what had always been mine. My hands were steady, my breath calm. The quiet resolve that had carried me through years of managing museum archives now guided me through the reconstruction of my own security. Finally, I walked to the front door and changed the lock code. The keypad beeped softly, almost apologetically, as if acknowledging the shift in power. I stood there a moment, feeling the weight of my keys in my hand, and understood that this small action, this boundary of metal and numbers, marked the real beginning of my defense. When the house was secure, I brewed a cup of tea and sat at the dining table. I opened my email and drafted a message to the financial firm Michael had contracted. My tone was firm but measured. I requested immediate suspension of all pending actions due to suspected misrepresentation. I attached copies of documents and flagged the account for legal review. Then I crafted a second message, this one addressed to my doctor, requesting a full cognitive evaluation. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew the value of formal evidence. Facts were the anchors that held the truth steady. By the time I finished, the sun had begun to lower, drawing long shadows across the floor. The lavender candle flickered softly, its scent weaving through the air like a reminder of the life I still commanded. I walked through the house once more, touching the frames, the books, the small objects Harold and I collected. Each one felt less like nostalgia and more like affirmation. This was my home. My life. My history. And I was reclaiming it, piece by quiet piece. I paused in the doorway of my study, looking at the room that had become the center of Michael's strategy. The papers on my desk were still slightly crooked from his earlier presence. I reached out and aligned them gently, not out of habit, but as a reminder that I was restoring order, not merely tidying a surface. I powered on my laptop again and opened a new document, typing a detailed timeline while the details remained vivid. Dates, times, conversations. The health monitoring application I never requested. The financial switch. The staged photos. The script of his voice through the study door. Each line felt like placing another stone into a structure meant to withstand scrutiny. When I finished, I printed a copy and slid it into a folder marked record. I placed it beside my planner, the two lying parallel like the first pages of a new archive, one I controlled. Outside, a faint pink spread across the sky as evening approached. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air touched my face, grounding me. The old maple swayed gently, the same tree Harold used to hang lights from each winter. I felt him there, not in grief, but in strength. I closed the door and locked it behind me. Another boundary set. Another quiet claim. I made a list next, written with the same care I once used in museum acquisitions: call Jenna upon landing, gather supporting statements, schedule evaluation, contact accountant, secure legal consultation, protect assets. Each task small, deliberate, achievable. By the time I finished, a calm resolve had settled fully around me. Not loud, not dramatic, simply present. The woman they believed they could quietly sideline no longer existed. Or perhaps she had always been here. I turned off the lights one by one, walking through each room with a sense of possession that felt both familiar and newly claimed. At the front door, I tested the lock code again. Secure. Final. Tomorrow, Jenna would arrive. The plan would take shape. But tonight, the most important action had already been taken. I had chosen myself. Jenna arrived the next morning just as the frost along the porch rail began to thaw. She stepped inside with a quiet confidence, her coat still holding the crisp chill of the air. I handed her the folder marked record without a word. She opened it, scanned the first few pages, and nodded once, a nod that meant the foundation was solid, the truth undeniable. While she settled at the dining table to review everything, I made coffee. The familiar hum of the machine felt almost ceremonial. When I set the mug beside her, she tapped the guardianship envelope with her pen. "This collapses immediately," she said. "No court will touch this once they see the inconsistencies." It was the first consequence. The quiet dismantling of Michael's plan. Jenna drafted a formal notice to the financial firm, citing manipulation and unauthorized access. She attached the evidence, each page methodically placed, each timestamp preserved. Within an hour, a reply came, "All activity frozen pending investigation." Michael's leverage, the account he had hoped to control, snapped shut like a locked archive drawer. The second consequence unfolded more slowly. Ms. Belmont responded to Jenna's inquiry with a curt, carefully worded message. She was withdrawing from further representation. Professional distance, she called it. But between the lines was something simpler. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one. The third consequence came when Jenna contacted the court clerk, providing the preliminary evidence and my request for an independent evaluation. The clerk's voice softened as she spoke. "This will halt any pending filing. We don't proceed with guardianship claims when capacity is clearly demonstrated." And then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. Late that afternoon, Michael arrived. He entered with the same hurried energy he always carried, but when he saw Jenna sitting at my dining table, his steps faltered. She rose slowly, sliding the folder closed. "Michael," she said. "We need to talk." He glanced at me, searching for the familiar softness I once offered so easily. But I remained still, composed. "Mom," he began, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," I said gently. "There hasn't." Jenna explained the legal ramifications, the misrepresentation, the documentation, the breached boundaries. Michael's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something quieter, heavier. Not remorse yet, but fear. "You can't do this," he said finally. "I already have," I replied. He looked around the room, the changed lock, the organized documents, the calmness he hadn't expected. The structure he had built was collapsing in front of him, not with accusation or fury, but with procedure. "This isn't what I wanted," he whispered. But the evidence resting between us said otherwise. He left without taking anything, not even his scarf draped on the chair. When the door clicked shut, a strange stillness settled. Not triumph, simply truth finding its place. In the days that followed, the consequences continued. His access revoked, his accounts flagged, his intentions documented, he stood on the outside of a life he once tried to control. Not punished. Simply accountable. I expected anger from him afterward, sharp messages, frantic calls. Instead, silence grew between us, an absence more revealing than confrontation. Jenna said this was common. When manipulation is exposed, people retreat, searching for narratives that absolve them. But the evidence remained unmovable. 2 days later, the financial firm sent another email. Their internal review confirmed irregular access tied directly to Michael's devices. They requested a formal statement, which Jenna drafted with surgical precision, factual, steady, without emotion. By the end of the week, they issued a formal notice. Michael was barred from all account control pending further legal verification. Another thread severed. Ms. Belmont mailed a brief letter, 4 sentences, each one colder than the last. She claimed she had been unaware of the full context. Perhaps she had. Perhaps she had chosen not to know. Either way, her withdrawal was a quiet admission. The case was no longer viable. On Monday, I received a call from the cognitive specialist. My evaluation results were clear: no impairment, no decline, no indication of compromised judgment. The report was stamped and signed. Jenna added it to the growing archive of truth. When Michael finally sent a message, it was brief. "I need time," he wrote. No apology. No acknowledgement. I read it once and set my phone aside. I no longer needed him to understand the weight of what he had done. The boundaries were in place. The consequences had already found him. And for the first time in months, the balance in my life felt restored, steady. A month after everything settled, I found myself standing in my new living room in Boulder, watching the light gather across the wooden floor the way morning snow gathers along a fence, quiet, soft, certain. The mountains rose behind the neighborhood like an old promise finally kept. I had chosen this place carefully, not as an escape, but as the first space I shaped entirely on my own terms. The house was smaller than the one in Denver, but it breathed easily. The windows opened to pine and sky, not the tension that had once lived behind every door. I arranged Harold's books on a narrow shelf by the fireplace, each one a reminder of the steady companionship that had shaped the foundation of my life. His favorite mug, blue, with the faded rim, rested on the counter beside a vase of dried lavender. The simplicity felt like exhale. April, the young archival science student I hired to help me organize Harold's papers, arrived every afternoon with a small notebook and a polite knock. She moved with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who understood the weight of preserving history. In time, our conversations drifted beyond documents. She told me about her studies, her hopes, the family estrangements she was trying gently to mend. She listened without judgment. I offered what guidance I could. Slowly, without intention, she became something close to kin. My granddaughter lived only 20 minutes away now. The first time my daughter-in-law placed her in my arms, the world steadied. Her tiny hand curled around my finger, warm and sure, unaware of the fracture that had opened between her father and me. I held her carefully, not wanting to pass down the weight of that silence. She deserved a beginning untouched by the paths adults sometimes wander. Life did not become perfect. Michael kept his distance, long, quiet stretches without a word. I accepted it not as punishment, but as a consequence belonging to him, not me. Boundaries, once set, have a way of revealing the strength or fragility of the relationships they frame. And though a part of me still wished he would choose honesty, I no longer built my days around that hope. Instead, I built something steadier. I walked the trails each morning, the air crisp with pine and memory. I volunteered twice a week at the small local museum, cataloging photographs donated by families who wanted their stories preserved. In each faded print, I saw reminders of resilience, faces weathered by time yet carrying unmistakable dignity. Their histories anchored me. Most evenings, I lit a candle, brewed tea in Harold's mug, and opened the folder of letters he had written over the years. Not out of grief, but gratitude. The past did not pull me backward anymore. It became a companion, steady and uncomplicated, walking beside the present rather than overshadowing it. Sometimes I thought of the moment I found the guardianship envelope on my porch, the chill in my hands, the stunned silence in my chest. Now, standing in the warmth of this new home, that memory felt like a turning point rather than a wound. A point where something within me reawakened. My life, once threatened with quiet erasure, had become unmistakably my own again. And in that truth, I found balance. In the quieter hours, when dusk settled along the mountains and the sky turned the color of old paper, I would sit by the window and let myself feel the fullness of this second beginning. Not a reinvention, no, I was still myself, but an honest alignment of who I had always been with how I chose to live now. There was a peace in that alignment, a steadiness I had once believed belonged only to younger years. But strength, I discovered, is not a possession of the young. It is a discipline of the patient, the observant, the quietly resilient. And I had earned it, page by page, year by year. And as the days unfolded gently forward, I felt something rare, a life no longer waiting for permission to be lived, but simply lived, wholly and steadily. In the quiet of my Boulder home, I often find myself returning to one simple truth: a life can be taken apart in whispers, but it can also be rebuilt in steady, intentional breaths. The guardianship envelope that once felt like a verdict now feels like a marker on a timeline, the moment I chose myself again. Some evenings, I sit beside the window with Harold's mug warming my hands, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind brushing the pines. These small, ordinary noises remind me that control never belonged in anyone else's hands. It was always mine, waiting for me to claim it. Michael's absence remains quiet, unresolved, but it no longer defines the borders of my days. I hope he finds honesty someday, but hope is no longer a condition for my peace. My granddaughter's smile, April's patient presence, the calm weight of a life lived on my own terms, these are the anchors I choose now. I learned that boundaries are not walls, they are doorways built with intention. And once I set mine, the world shifted into place. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.